So it is 2 o'clock. We will go ahead and start the recording so that if someone gets in late, they can just watch the beginning part of the meeting. And since you are all here at 2 o'clock, I'm going to go ahead and get us started. Diane, I'm going to share my screen. And if you don't see my PowerPoint in a moment, will you give me a shout?
Absolutely.
Perfecto. There you go. So today, you should be able to access all materials for our presentation on the Midwest PBIS page. If you click under Coaches and then Coaches Network Meetings, you will see the November meeting with today's PowerPoint and other materials. It might be helpful to download the PowerPoint, so if there are materials that you think would be beneficial, you can just steal them, right? Delete PowerPoint slides, grab activities. So it might be helpful to have this PowerPoint open as we walk through. We're going to spend about a little bit more than the first hour walking you through classroom practices through the lens of remote and hybrid learning. And then we'll wrap up that portion of the meeting and go ahead and ask you to fill out the exit slip, or at least open the exit slip, because last month we didn't get as many responses as we hoped, and we really want to make certain that the meeting meets your needs, and so we need that feedback to guide our planning for the next month. And then we're going to break out into TA sessions. And I apologize in advance because it's just Diane and I today. We'll only have 2 breakout sessions, one focused on classroom practices, which is today's topic, and one which Diane will lead on check-in, check-out, and SAGE. So, classroom practices, very tier 1 based. And then Diane will be leading that technical assistance related to tier 2, check-in, check-out, and SAGE groups. I'm Trish Rode. I'm the Director of Research and Eval since August of this year. But previous to that, I was the Director of Curriculum Instruction for School District U46 for 8 years. And before that, I was a principal and a middle school math teacher who implemented PBIS in the classroom and school-wide. I'll let my esteemed colleague introduce herself, and then we'll jump right into content.
Good afternoon. If I'm new to anybody, I am Diane Lemaster with the Midwest PBIS Network. Have been involved with PBIS and worked with it since 1999. So whenever I say that, I know I show my age, but it is what it is. So better to be here than elsewhere. And implementing PBIS and multi-tiered system of supports at the building level, at a district level. I was an internal building-based coach. I was a district coordinator prior to my retirement, and then was lucky enough to be able to continue this work with the Illinois network and now Midwest. So I have many, many years of experience of implementing PBIS supports, and I'm happy to be here with you guys. So welcome.
Perfecto. So as most of you know, here at Midwest PBIS, we're a hub of the Center on PBIS. We hope that you all were able to join us last week at the forum where we got to hear from the great George Sugai and see additional amazing sessions talking about implementing PBIS at tier 1, 2, and 3. And you'll find many of the materials that we reference actually come from the center. And we partner with West 40 here. So in chat, we'd like you to take a second, because we know that this is constantly shifting given positivity rates, etc. If you're talking about your district right now, we'd like to know how your students are presently learning. Are they fully in person? Are you in a hybrid model? Or are you remote? Or a mix? Do you have some of your early learners and special ed students in person or hybrid, and some of your kids in remote? That'll help us continue to focus in on kind of the resources that you might need today. So in chat, just please take a moment and give us a heads up: fully in person, hybrid, remote, or a mix of the many, many, many. I'm going to pause my screen share so I can see your responses.
A lot of remotes. That's, to me so far, Trish, it looks like that's the majority. I'm seeing a little bit of both. A couple fully in person, which is interesting, but a lot of remote.
And it'll be interesting to watch as we go into flu season, right? We're getting those positivity rates up here in the north and now even central Illinois, where I'm originally from. It'll be interesting to watch. And I know I say interesting, when you're living it every day, it doesn't feel very interesting, right? It kind of stress inducing just thinking about it. Please know that you are constantly in our thoughts while you're constantly facing an ever-changing landscape of putting things on pause and being back remote. Yeah. I would imagine, and we're going to spend most of our time thinking about classroom practices today through the lens of remote, because we have a lot of experience in person, right? And hybrid is a mix of in-person and remote. And so many of us, as you've noted in chat, are either having portions of our students in remote or have shifted back for 10 days now or for the unforeseeable future. And so we'll spend time in thinking about what the classroom practices look like in remote. Fully remote, going hybrid next week. And those things can change at any moment, right? You just wait for the next email to come. Okay, so I'm going to go back to sharing my screen really quick so that we can work through our content for today. So one thing, given our current context, given our constant barrage of the election commercials or polls or news, given our never constant demands around our schools, we really want to refocus ourselves on some positives. So thinking about just what you guys said, right? Some of you started someplace and then you shifted again. I want you to think about, and then drop in chat, I'll have Diane share with us some of the big takeaways. What are you most proud about when you think about either your school or your district and how you all have worked together to support students and families given all that we're facing right now?
Jamie said she's still able to see her kids. Proud of the tier 2 teams, and they're using parent survey data. That's awesome, to identify students in need of additional supports. Hotspots for every family, and that's huge. The lack of technology, the lack of Wi-Fi has been huge for a lot of districts, so that's nice to see that we're providing that as much as possibly can. Proud of the mask mandate. Dedication, creativity. Yep, go ahead, Trish.
Yeah, as Diane continues to kind of filter through those, and you guys look through those, I want you to look through and recognize, and sometimes as humans, right, we tend to focus on what's not going well. And given our current context and just they're feeling like there's no safe space between the election, the health, and our current districts and what we're facing, I would just encourage you to continue to, when possible, acknowledge what's going well. Acknowledge, those bright, shining acts of kindness and expressing gratitude, because they really do help bolster your mood, given the fact that too much of the news is negative. Diane, you want to share a couple more and then we'll move on?
Yeah, just some about providing every student with an iPad or a Chromebook or a laptop. Proud of the collaboration that's ongoing. I think Priscilla said earlier up that PBIS is the one thing that feels kind of normal and constant. So that was really nice to read. Just listening to families and what they need. Google Classroom for being able to see students. Aaron said that they began their year fully in person with a remote option, and they're still open, which is amazing, Aaron, because we've had some schools around here in the suburbs of Chicago that started remotely, started to bring kids back, and then of course positivity rates are climbing the charts here, so now they're all back remote again. So it's like kind of a seesaw, kind of going back and forth. Continuing to provide lunches for all students that requested. flexibility of staff. And that's huge. I know all of your staff are really having to be flexible and kind of go with the flow, because it's just that flow changes all the time. So they have to kind of go with it. And I think our staff is just doing amazing work.
Yeah, I think the only thing constant right now is change, right?
Yeah.
That is the only constant we are experiencing, is constant change. So it's one of the reasons we chose to focus on classroom practices, because we get so many questions about what this looks like, especially in a virtual / remote / hybrid setting. Like, what does classroom practices, how does that translate? And we started doing some work over the virtual institutes to think through this, and have gotten great examples from some of the districts that have contributed to our folder or been in our PD. So just as a reminder, and I so appreciate those of you who are able to stay on camera, while acknowledging that there might be instances where you need to turn that camera off. I was warning Diane that if my internet connection becomes unstable, you won't see me for a little bit, so I'll turn off my video and that will help. But again, it's nice to see, because we're not able to be together, your bright, shiny faces at 2 o'clock on a Monday afternoon. We ask that you stay engaged, that you show your respect by muting your mic, participating, being committed, and being in as quiet a place as you can be, again, given our current situations. While understanding that if you're working from home, we know that many of you have small people that might come into the frame, or coworkers, etc. So today, our purpose and goals are for you to think about needs-based. So what your staff needs to help install those classroom practices, build your fluency with the observation rubric for each of the practices, and think through what your adult learners might need, especially given our current context. We're going to discuss those classroom practices through the lens of remote settings, describe how they support students, especially students impacted by trauma. And as we all know, we're experiencing our own uncertainties, and certainly kids are feeling that as well. We're going to talk about using data to identify practices, and then identify those multi-tiered supports that our adult learners need to implement the practices that we're asking them to implement. So we're not going to spend a lot of time on Zoom, on Zoom rules or Zoom functions, because you have been Zooming for months now. But in this PowerPoint, if you downloaded it, if there's some functionality that you are not familiar with, there are hidden slides in this PowerPoint that you could use, that you could share in presentations. If you are unable to use a Zoom feature, just shoot Diane a message, or myself a message, and we'll help you when possible. You've already started using the chat, so it looks like you've been at this before. The only thing that I'm going to ask you to consider is to rename yourself with one of the room titles. We're going to try one of the new functions of Zoom, which is for you to self-select the room when we do technical assistance. So either classroom practices tier 1 or check and check out Sage tier 2. But if you can rename yourself, just in case that feature doesn't work the way we hope it will, or you don't have the updated version of Zoom, it'll just help us expedite that process for that second half. So when you get a chance, rename yourself so you either have classroom practices or tier 1, or check and check out Sage or tier 2 right next to your name. And that way, if you have trouble getting into the breakout room on your own, we can help you get in there. So one of the things that we're going to do, we're going to celebrate today, we're going to talk about the positives, is those of you who have shared examples. We've been asking for several months, because you guys are out there in the field trying this out, to share in our shared folder for COVID-19. Underneath the virtual coaches network meetings is a shared folder. And we've had some districts, in fact, several districts, share materials with us, so that, the matrix that we've shown over and over again from that Springfield district. In addition, we've received resources from Bensonville. I saw Missy earlier pop in here, from U46, from Cary School District, Quincy's, Sandburg's, Brooks Middle School, Union Ridge. all of these schools have shared resources to that folder, and we're teachers, right? We don't need to recreate the wheel. When people do good stuff, we want to grab that stuff and use it in our context. So a huge shout out to those districts. Please know that we also sent them a token, a small token of appreciation for those resources that they shared with us. So don't forget, if you have, especially as we're thinking through the lens of classroom practices today, if there are examples from your district, you are more than we would love for you to share them in chat, but also please, please, please consider sharing them in that COVID-19 folder so that we can both spotlight your work and share those amazing resources with others so that we're not all trying to recreate the wheel. And here's the way that you can share right in today's chat. And if it's a Google link, you could just drop the link. But if you actually want to share a file, like a Google Doc, etc., or an actual Word doc, how many of us still save stuff in Word, right? You can open the chat, select to everyone, and then click on the file, and it will retrieve the file for you and link it in the chat. So all year so far, since the meeting started in August, have been focused on this idea of ISF, right? Interconnected Systems Framework. The whole idea of having a framework that we're all aware of. Diane was sharing this from one of the chat messages, right? PBIS is the only thing that seems normal right now, right? And one of the reasons that PBIS seems normal is because it's a framework, and you can make this framework work in any context. In fact, that's one of the strengths of the framework that is PBIS, and that is multi-tiered systems of support. And so we want to continue to develop content around this idea that we need to bring the resources that we're using together under one framework. In fact, by us embedding trauma-informed care, as well as classroom practices, we want to show and talk through the whole idea that these aren't different things. These aren't new things that teachers have to learn. Instead, PBIS is a way to organize those things in a way that makes sense for adults. So most of you know the classroom practices, right? There are 6 classroom practices: physical environment, having a teaching matrix, active supervision, encouraging appropriate behavior, the continuum of responses for response strategies for inappropriate behavior, and engagement and opportunities to respond. Today, we're going to think through those strategies, thinking through the very specific lens of a remote learning environment. Know that classroom teaching matrix, right, really talks through this whole idea of giving kids what the expectations are and making certain that we're defining those rules and routines for kids and reteaching them as necessary. That encouraging appropriate behavior really is about having a system for teaching what we expect kids to know and be able to do, and then acknowledging that behavior when we see it. And then the continuum of response strategies for inappropriate behavior really help us respond, because even if we have the most well-ordered Canvas platform or Google Classroom or in-person learning structure, kids are still going to make choices that we need to respond to in the classroom. So you guys have seen our 3 interlocking bubbles, right? But one of the purposes, the main purpose of PBIS is to make sure that schools are effective and equitable, right? Thinking through that equity lens. And so that learning environment is accessible for all students. And as we look at some of the research, although it will be very brief today when we think through the trauma-informed lens, but what we would assert is that having a positive, predictable, consistent, safe, and equitable environment, which is what PBIS is really designed to do, is a trauma response, right? Giving kids consistency and safety will help students who are facing trauma. And we've been doing research in trauma for quite a long while now, but given our current context, we see larger groups of kids demonstrating the effects of trauma, right? Especially since March and beyond. So we wanted to make certain to draw attention to the Trauma Lens Crosswalk for these 6 established classroom practices. We know that a physical environment exists in a remote setting as well as in an in-person setting, and a well-designed classroom really promotes that sense of safety and security, which kids who are facing trauma really crave, really need. That teaching consistently expectations supports regulation, and it helps kids develop social and emotional competencies. Actively supervising kids also gives them a sense of safety, and encouraging that appropriate behavior really helps. And we're going to talk about especially group contingencies. Those strategies really help to build a sense of community and strengthen relationship between students, while also supporting kids and reteaching expectations as a response to inappropriate behavior really helps students to regulate and develop relationship with the adults and develop strategies for problem solving. Finally, that whole idea of frequent opportunities for giving kids the opportunity to respond helps kids, all kids, to improve learning outcomes. So let's think through classroom practices in hybrid and remote. So many of you talked about some of these, I don't know, they're constants now, right? They're not changing. The idea of having face masks, the idea of remote learning, the idea of the pandemic, needing computers, the news that we're watching around demonstrations, riots, racial inequality, the election, all of these things seem to be in some ways pressing in on us as adults and students as well. And so we really believe that implementing PBIS, especially classroom practices, help to support kids while it feels like everything around them has shifted. I would also say, totally aligned to our self-care topic last month, that this is also true for us as adults, right? There hasn't been a feeling of maybe safety and consistency in our adult lives as well. Certainly, given our current condition, bullet number 1, right? Most of you talked about this when you shared in chat. What we know is constant is change and disruption right now. And this is going to cause there to be larger gaps for students. This is going to cause vulnerable students to have larger gaps. We're going to have an emphasis, and we have been having an emphasis for the last 6 months on new practices, new software, new ways of engaging with students and with families. We also know that relationships are harder when they're social distance and when they're remote. And we've heard from teachers repeatedly that developing those relationships, especially for teachers like those middle and high school students that you all were mentioning in your remote only option, are much harder when I haven't even met my 8th grade students in person this year to get to know them. So certainly now more than ever, that idea of having systems, using data, and implementing practices that are effective and research-based will help us meet our targets of improved student outcomes. So given all of the changes that you talked about in chat when you first entered, I want you to think about when your team took the TFI in the spring, right, as we all do, to get ready for planning for this year. What action steps were on your TFI pre-COVID? I'm going to stop sharing and I want you to share in chat. And how has the planning that you did in spring, because many of us, even though we left our buildings in March, thought we were going to be back by fall, and all of that shifted once again over the summer. So how has what were your original action steps? Pick one from your TFI in the spring, and then give an example of how you've had to shift based on the current reality of COVID in your district. I'm going to stop sharing so I can see your chat. Oh, Allison, no in-person training. And Susan, you wanted, based on TFI, you wanted to update some tier 2 practices, and you kind of put that on hold to address what was an immediate need. One thing we heard from districts to a certain extent over the summer was that they had to go back, just like Missy said, right? And focus on what tier 1 looked like in this new context. So some of you are new and you've been having to think about PBIS through the lens of COVID since you began, but some of us felt like we were strong implementers or implementing pretty well. And we almost had to go back and really look at our practice at tier 1 because so much shifted, and teachers, adults were having trouble wrapping their brains around what does this look like in a remote or hybrid setting. Oh, Beth, yeah, absolutely. The adults, some of the adults in our organizations are kind of wilting on the vine, right? And so thinking about those self-care practices and trying to get adults what they need right now is so important in some of our settings, because they have been impacted by so much trauma that they're struggling on a daily basis. Thank you guys so much for sharing. I absolutely think, Beth and others, where you have some adults really, really floundering in this new setting, going back and watching that self-care video from our last meeting and using some of those resources available in the self-care. You know, adults can't give to kids if they don't have anything left. And I know that as I've continued to talk with my peers that are still in districts, they're seeing more absenteeism with no subs. And so the more we can think of ways to take care of adults, it's so important right now. And as we head into the dark months of winter and the cold and the possibility of lockdown, I can't encourage strongly enough your own self-care and thinking about what the adults might benefit by in your district. So don't forget, last meeting we had the self-care and we shared a lot of resources that might be helpful for your district. Okay, Diane, I'm hoping you guys see the PowerPoint. Nothing more embarrassing than speaking and there's a blank screen in the back. So good classroom management is tied to student outcomes, both academically and behaviorally. It really supports those at-risk students, and it really helps support prevention of behavior problems. It also, as we said earlier, which is so important for our trauma-informed approaches, signals to kids that the classroom is safe. So when we talk trauma, especially now, we know that implementing the classroom practices supports all students, especially those that are coming from trauma backgrounds. We also know that the whole idea of the behavioral framework, establishing expectations, teaching those expectations, when we implement PBIS with fidelity, we actually come at this from a trauma-informed, equity-informed lens. And so it's so important that we implement, and I notice I said with fidelity, not just the pieces of PBIS, but the system as a whole. The data, systems, and practices have to be done together. So we've heard this quote a million times, right? Kids don't care what you know until they know that you care. But given what Beth just said, and we've talked to others about the way the adults in our organization are feeling right now, right? Often adults aren't accessible to us, just like kids aren't accessible to teachers until they know that you care, until they see that you're there to help support them. So in your roles, because many of you are either building-based coaches or district-based coaches or classroom teachers that have taken on the mantle of being the tier 1 coach or being on the tier 1 or tier 2 team, it's super important as we think through what the adults need, that they too know that you care, right, about them and have thought about them when you're designing the learning they need to implement practices for kids. So when you're in a coaching role, whether it be on the team or at the building or at the district level, often your learners are the adults that you work with, even if you still work with kids too, and they need to know that you care just as much as kids need to know their teachers care. Does that make sense? So I think the idea of fight, flight, or freeze in the classroom is super important for us to think through, especially in a remote setting, because it's often harder to really monitor for these when we're on a Zoom together. These come from Fostering Resilient Learners, Sowers and Hall book, right? And fight, flight, or freeze looks different in the classroom. So flight or avoiding, right, might look like withdrawing, fleeing the classroom, turning our camera off, not coming to class. Fighting might seem like acting out, but it also might seem like being silly or being off task. It might feel a little defiant. Freezing might be refusing to engage in any of the activities, whether that be chat or polls or in the groups that you put them in when they're in breakout. So fight, flight, or freeze looks different in the classroom as well as in the remote classroom. So think about how this might translate if we were in a Zoom meeting. So if your school is remote or hybrid and they are home learning, think about what flight, fight, or freeze might look like. And I gave a couple examples, right? Turning off your camera, etc. What might flight, fight, or freeze look like if we are teaching remotely? If you just share 1 or 2 examples in the chat.
Cameras off. I'm just reading some of the chats.
Yeah.
Moving away from seats, cameras off, kids watching videos. Huge eyes, covering their face, not responding, leaving meeting, moving around.
And you have to balance that, right? Because we've talked a lot, even internally, about being mindful of kids being embarrassed by their household or etc. So you have to balance wanting them to have their camera on, especially if in your district you've provided Chromebooks, iPads, whatever your technology is. In those settings, helping kids figure out how to put up a virtual background might help them keep their camera on, if that makes sense. I know when this is the office at my new house. We just moved on October 2nd, but certainly the first few days that we moved in, I had a box fort all behind me. Diane can attest to that. But there are a lot of reasons why kids might be embarrassed by the background at their house. I know that when we were remote learning in U46 in spring, because I oversaw curriculum, I had to work with a principal who's a grandmother of a student receiving a clarinet lesson came into the screen not fully dressed. Right? So there's a lot of reasons why kids might not have their cameras on. So you have to balance the need to see them and engage with them and maybe teach them some technology so that they're not embarrassed about their setting. And certainly this time now more than ever, if we could approach our current context with a growth mindset, teaching kids that we value them and care about them and want good things for them that helps them develop resilience, right? Parent or caregiver or us as their stable relationship, but also teaching them that the pandemic isn't, oh, I look like I'm unstable, so I'm going to turn off my camera. Okay. Helping build their resiliency. So acknowledging that we're struggling right now, that it's very unsettling being in a pandemic, but that there will be a tomorrow and there will be a 2021 and we will see the light at the end of the tunnel. And developing that relationship with students will help them build resiliency, and building that relationship and resiliency and developing and strengthening those relationships, we will see fewer discipline problems with students. So I want to go back here before we move on, before we move on to classroom practices and really break them out one at a time. If you struggle, or if you believe you will struggle with the adults in your building, taking classroom practices back, given the fact that your district is focused on equity, or your district is focused on trauma, or your district is focused on give me a title. The whole idea that PBIS can make sense of all this work and be a framework to embed this work for the adults. So it's not one more thing added to the plate, it's the plate, right? Where we organize this work, because when we implement PBIS with fidelity, we create equitable systems that are safe and positive and consistent, and therefore trauma informed for our kids. So the classroom practices, and they are here on this slide. We referenced them before, but I wanted to remind you that when we think about encouraging appropriate behavior, so that's number 4 of the classroom practices, this is the teaching of our expectations, rules, and routines. This is that pre-correcting for the behavior that we want to see. This is that positive specific praise. This is that, especially in a remote learning, that group contingency, because teachers have said to us, if I'm a middle school teacher or high school teacher and I have 150 kids, how am I supposed to be keeping track of individual students? And if we don't have Hero or another system to reward points. We're going to talk a little bit about group contingencies, which I think are incredibly promising for our current condition. And then when we think about continuum of responses, don't forget that in a remote setting especially, if I was trying to get Diane on task, instead of calling out Diane for her infraction, I could instead highlight Missy in engaging in the behavior that I want. And in some ways, especially if Diane thinks a lot of Missy, which I know she does, then when I praise Missy, Diane might replicate that behavior, right? That's what that means when we give that as an example. And we're going to practice as well that specific error correction, and then talk through a little regulate, relate, and reason. So we looked at trauma through our classroom practices through the trauma lens. Now let's think about it through its distance learning application. So the next few slides have actually come from, and I don't have my camera up, I'll pop it back up. Hopefully my internet connection is more stable now. Okay. So much of the materials that we're going to cover in the next few slides, and I will make certain to send it out with the video when we post the video, is coming from the Distance Learning Playbook, which is from Fisher, Fry, and Hattie. So most of you in education know Hattie's work, right? Effect size work. And Fisher and Fryer did a lot of work and just published this summer this amazing resource for teachers called the Distance Learning Playbook, because it wasn't.
You're freezing up again, Trish. You're going to have to take your camera off again. You're freezing.
My screen.
Yeah.
Yep. There we go. I got my camera off again. Sorry about that. So in this table, I've actually linked the rubrics to the classroom practices. So I will click on one just to show it to you. I hope I will click on one and it will go there. It's going to go very slow. So I'll talk through it while it opens. So each of the classroom practices has an attached tool for us to think about what this looks like in practices. So this is the physical environment one. And obviously some of us are not in person. So the idea of having our desks 6 feet apart, et cetera, is not an area of focus for us right now. What I appreciate though, is that in the distance learning handbook, it encourages us to not just think through the lens of the idea of a physical space, but also the idea of what their online classroom looks like, if that makes sense. So if you're using Google Classroom, or I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint. If I'm using Google Classroom, I want that to be organized. I don't want a stream of consciousness. I want there to be organization in the way that I post my materials to the classroom. I want there to be consistency of practice of where kids find those materials, so that, and I apologize, I'm going to share again so that you can see the grid, so that kids know what to expect, right? One of the things that we said we needed was consistency. Consistency helps kids feel safe. So a physical environment just doesn't have to be in person. We could also think through, what does our learning platform look like? What does our screen look like when we're sharing with kids in a Zoom? Is it full of many open tabs, or is it organized? That classroom teaching matrix. Most of you, I know Missy and other districts have shared with us, Springfield, et cetera, have updated their teaching matrix to tell kids what their expectations are in hybrid or in our fully remote. And then develop the teaching plan for kids to teach them what we expect to see. Again, in a distance learning environment, active supervision might be thinking through, how do we monitor student engagement during synchronous time and during asynchronous time? Like, how are we monitoring that kids are engaged with us when we're in person online, or when they're doing the work when we're not with them live? The idea of encouraging appropriate behavior. Are we pre-correcting for the behavior we want to see before we put kids in breakouts? Are we popping into those breakout rooms and spotlighting and giving kids positive, specific praise when they're doing what they're supposed to be doing when we pop into breakouts? When we think about error correction, how are we responding to inappropriate behavior in a Zoom setting? So are we calling kids out like we would never do in person? Or are we either one, pushing kids into breakout rooms and then keeping one kiddo with us and talking through something, or sending private chat? How are we adjusting our response for remote learning? And then, especially important right now, is how are we engaging kids and giving them multiple opportunities to respond? Because the more kids that are engaged in our activities, the more likely it is that they are hitting their outcome goals. And thinking through the lens of, one of the things that became a cadence when we were working with teachers in the spring. So not during high quality distance learning pedagogy, but during crisis teaching in the spring, was the idea that assigning is not teaching. That became a mantra, right? Assigning is not teaching. Assigning a worksheet or a packet or a flip grid, even though it's cool because it's flip grid, is not teaching. And so how are we making our instruction relevant and still grounded in standards and context? So the physical environment, right? This is the traditional implementation of in-person. Is it a well-ordered space? Do kids have easy entry and exit? Are the materials labeled? Do we currently have a matrix up? Are we teaching from that matrix? Here are the considerations of remote settings that might be helpful as you're working with teachers that are struggling with the concept of really supporting all kids in a remote environment. Again, classroom teaching matrix. So that traditional implementation of our expectations versus, sorry, real quick, with the reminder that a classroom-based teaching matrix, Diane always does such a wonderful job when we train classroom practices of reminding teachers that this should include what it looks like in their classroom, but still be aligned to the school-wide matrix, right? Just like we would have, here's what being safe and responsible looks like in the lunchroom. What does it look like in 214? And what does it look like on our Tuesday morning Zoom? So classroom teaching expectations, again, should be modified for remote learning. They're still entering and exiting your room, even in a Zoom setting. That idea of how they participate, is it in the chat? Do they raise their hand? Do they chat in the chat function? Do they chat just to you? Do they chat to everyone? These are the types of things that we always think through when we're in person, but I don't think we've been at this distance learning long enough that sometimes we miss some of these nuances, if you will, of remote. So we've shared multiple iterations of remote learning matrices. Many of you have them and have shared them with us as well. We also are often asked what this might look like in a hybrid setting. So we wanted to share an additional option of what do our expectations look like when we're hybrid? Active supervision. Again, so if you're in a classroom, you might scan certain vectors, if you will, of your room on an ongoing basis. If you're online, you're using that video in that chat feature. You're working in small groups, and moving isn't moving back to the back of the room. It's actually popping into those breakout rooms to work with groups so that kids know that their teacher is going to come to them just like they would in the classroom. Encouraging appropriate behavior is still the expectation that we're teaching those new expectations and reteaching, that we're pre-correcting for the behaviors that we want to see, that we're giving positive specific praise and heavily using group contingencies. So many of you have been through our training and know what acknowledging looks like, but acknowledging in the virtual room might be, Diane, thank you for your virtual hand raise. That is being respectful. Or in a group setting, like when we do breakouts, team A completed all of the Google Classroom prompt before our class meeting was done today. Well done. Way to show responsibility. So it's still identifying the student or group, including a term of praise, acknowledging the very specific rule that they were following, and then linking it to the school-wide expectations, and either giving individual points to Diane, and some people are tracking that in a spreadsheet, or using that group contingency. So kids have acknowledged what would incentivize them, and they're working their way towards a 5-minute dance party or 10-minute Kahoot or whatever it is that incentivizes them. That helps create that sense of community in the classroom when we use group contingencies. So we will take, I hope that one of you will give me a specific example of what a positive specific praise statement might look for an individual or a group in a remote setting.
feel free to unmute as well if it's easier just to share versus chat.
Donnie, thank you for raising your hand and waiting to unmute. That was very respectful. Thank you, Beth. They're starting to roll and it takes a couple seconds to type. You're right, Diane. We also have been helping people think through, like, how do we go from the tangible ticket to the virtual? So I've seen people use spreadsheets. I've seen people use Google Forms, but we have heavily seen the use of group contingencies. I'm actually going to go there. Here's one example from our friends from down south in Florida. Florida PBIS, I believe we have an example from Nevada as well. So they are spotlighting this idea of, again, students earning class points toward a virtual dance party or an enrichment activity like a Kahoot. So it's super helpful to have the kids establish what incentivizes them. So if it's a dance party, a Kahoot, what is it that they as a group hope to earn? Or even 5 minutes of social time on a Zoom with each other, right? Or a game of some sort. My 12-year-old who's in 8th grade, they were playing a game. It was very reminiscent of Heads Up, 7-Up. I don't know how you pull that off on Zoom. I was just walking through the dining room, but he had to turn away from the Zoom, right? So even when they're middle schoolers, almost in high school, they get incentivized and miss each other, right? They miss being in person with each other. So having the group create a list of things that incentivize them, and then using this group contingency so that if everyone turns, these things in, or we have a certain number of class periods with no infractions, or whatever the goal is, it's super helpful when kids establish what they're going to earn, and that group contingency creates a sense of community, especially given right now when we're not always in person. So please download the PowerPoint. There's several examples on this slide that you can link to. I'm going to kind of hurry through the next few slides, partially because I want to talk a little bit more about some of the distance learning embedded resources. So obviously, we're still going to have kids that need additional supports, that even when we pre-correct and we teach the behaviors we want to see, that they need additional supports. And those might have to be shifted up, right? You can't just go stand next to Diane or next to Beth if they're not acting appropriately in our Zoom. So we'll have to get a little more creative and reteach, give that positive specific behavior praise to a peer that they very much value, come up with signals, or send private chat in the Zoom to remind a student of what our expectation is. All of these supports for responding to inappropriate behavior. So one of the areas that we've had the most questions on is the idea of engagement and opportunities to respond in a virtual setting. It's very important to have that wait time to monitor teacher talk versus student talk. That's actually in the rubric from the original classroom practices. But a little too often, especially my secondary peers, have just translated their lecture from the classroom to their lecture online, right? So monitoring that teacher talk time. I'm a math teacher by trade. I had a bunch of science friends, right? There should not be more teacher talk than there is student talk, whether you're on Zoom or in person. Mixing up the types of engagement, the types of activities for students, so that it's not, while we want consistency, we don't want boredom, right? Boredom, if you know Hattie's research, has a negative impact on students' learning. And then think about that idea of moving from doing to driving. Think about that for a minute. Doing to driving. Am I just doing what the teacher tells me to do? Or am I driving my own learning? Super important when we think about those teachers that have a tendency to lecture and fill up the Zoom, just like they filled up the classroom with a lot of teacher talk, as opposed to giving kids the opportunity to drive their own learning in a virtual setting. So one of the things that was especially powerful for us as we were looking for resources to help teachers make this shift to online, was thinking about what they were trying to help kids with and then identifying tools from a technology standpoint that might be helpful to their practice. Now, there's a lot of tools over on the right-hand side, and I strongly caution you, those people in your building that hate the Google, that can't barely make attachments, right? Don't show them this whole thing. Or for some, right? I see you laughing. If you show them this whole thing, they immediately shut down. So my non-technology friends, my people that like to feel competent and they like to hit that mastery level, are really struggling right now because there's so much new learning for them as adults. So maybe you take one of these in each category and you get good at it so you can show other people. Once that they see that they can be good at this, then you can show them some additional ones, but don't show them all these, especially because they don't need to master a Kahoot and a Quizlet, and because they're doing the same thing, right? I strongly suggest, so finding information, right? Like if you want the engagement activity to be locating that information, to be organizing it, any of those sample tools will be helpful. If it's using information, a lot of teachers, we helped learn Flipgrid. It was pretty easy to learn. It was pretty low-hanging fruit for my tech-phobic friends. Creating information, most of us know Google Docs. But there's some other fun ones in there too, right? If TikTok doesn't get taken away, TikTok is one that kids really enjoy and get really creative with. And then sharing information. Having their own YouTube channel, using WeVideo. Again, though, if you're bringing this information back to the teachers in your in your building, and they are your friends that need a lot of tech support, do not show them this whole grid. Show them one of these things and then help them learn how to do it. Have your own mini play date. Have a Zoom after school where you demonstrate one of these and you make them create their own before they leave you. Because if they just sit and listen to you talk about Kahoot, when you log off your Zoom and they try to make their Kahoot on their own, they will be calling you. So in addition to having tools aligned to what we're asking students to do and helping the adults in our building learn how to use those new tools, we also need to think about how we might design with engagement in mind. So again, moving from doing to driving. So how can we take a closed task, a fill in the blank, a knowledge-based task, and make it more open for kids? How can we move for getting information to understand, lower level, right, to requiring students to connect that to prior learning, relate it to current construct? How can we ask students at the beginning what they think rather than telling them what they'll need? And then think about how we can go from procedural, algorithmic teaching to problem solving, and especially given if you're playing bingo right now, I hope it's not a drinking game because some of you are still in your offices. But if you write this present context that I keep talking about, but let's think about our present context. We are constantly problem solving as adults. We cannot come out of this pandemic without changing the way we teach kids. And one of the ways that we can change that is going from teaching them procedures to helping them be problem solvers, right? Acknowledging where we're struggling, acknowledging that we don't always get this right, being open and transparent, and allowing them the freedom to acknowledge that they don't know everything either, and that they will make mistakes, but that we will problem solve this together. So we're going to go into a breakout, and when we come back, we're going to talk very briefly about just thinking through the different ways that we're working with adults right now and where we might be able to insert some of this learning. We're going to break out, and I want you to think about, as we think about the classroom practices, right, the 6 classroom practices, how in your building, in your district, are you identifying which classroom practices your teachers need support with, and how are you providing that support? So the great Diane Lemaster is going to put us in random breakout rooms. It'll be our only breakout before we come back, talk about coaching, and then go into our technical assistance time. But I want you to go into your breakout room and share, how are you identifying which classroom practices your teachers need support with, and how are you giving them that support? We're going to spend about 10 minutes. That's why we're only doing one breakout, because in your exit slip feedback, even though there wasn't a lot, you did say that you had trouble kind of getting through the task. So instead of doing a couple breakouts, we'll do one, and we'll spend 10 minutes